So, hello everybody. I have the pleasure to have here with me Dr. Vinay Prasad, um, who is a guy that I actually first got to know from your article in Nature when you wrote about precision oncology. I was actually preparing an article about precision cardiology in cardiology, and I ran into your article. I thought it was very good. It was very much in line. So, and it was important for me because I was talking about if there's not precision oncology, imagine precision cardiology. So I started to quote a lot of your article, and then I got to know your plenary sessions, your great podcast, and that I recommend to everybody in Brazil. And so I got very understand how you think, and I thought it could be a very good conversation we have here. We have a lot in common in terms of the way of thinking. And my take here, and you're a guy who does evidence-based medicine and meta research and things like this. You're different from the majority because you're able to align a very good way of thinking clinically and the scientific think. So you're like a very good physician who thinks strongly scientifically. And we have to teach people how to do this. I think it's very special of yours. But I have to read a little bit of your resume here. So Vinay Prasad, MD, Master in Philosophy, hematologist, oncologist, and associate professor of medicine at Oregon Health and Science University. So he studies cancer drugs, health policy, evidence-based medicine. He is the author of 200 academic articles, co-author of the book Ending Medical Reversal, and author of the forthcoming book Malignant. And of course, he is the host of the great podcast Plenary Section that I recommend to everybody. So Vinay, thank you very much for being here with us. My first question to you is, how did you become what you are? So good in evidence-based medicine, such a leader. Was it planned from the beginning or it just happened?
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. I guess I'd say, you and I are very similar. I think the only difference is I'm an oncologist, you're a cardiologist. I think we have similar interests. I've read your papers with interest over the years. I guess I'd say to answer your question that it certainly wasn't planned. I think I went to medical school, I think, to be a doctor, and I had planned on primarily, taking care of patients and running a clinic. I still do that, but I didn't imagine having a research career or research focus. And I think, I think you're one of the few people who really kind of understand what this is all about. It's about thinking scientifically. We're supposed to be doctors who think scientifically about questions and answer questions with the best available evidence and in a scientific way. And I guess I've been disappointed to learn that there are so many, even expert physicians, who do not think scientifically and don't really teach that. And so I felt like the only reason I do research is I feel like I have to do this research. And, just like you feel compelled to have a blog or to have a podcast because we need to teach the next generation of physicians how to think better about these problems. This is nothing novel. We're not saying anything super clever. These are principles that have been known for 40, 50 years. It's just convenient to ignore them, and it's often profitable to ignore them.
Right.
But the principles don't go away.
Right. So I asked you that because when people ask me, how do you become evidence-based medicine guy, I have the same answer. It just happened. I think it happened because of some kind of background on research. So when you like research, you start thinking scientifically, and I had to to create principles for my thinking in terms of my decision making. So I kind of built for myself those scientific principles on how to think, how to translate science to medicine. And so that's how it started. And I think it's a very similar experience. And what I say to my students and colleagues, etc., is that there is no evidence-based medicine actually. There's only one thing, which is medicine.
Right.
And medicine should be evidence-based. It's not like a specialty or something like this. Like you said, we're not saying anything super clever. It's like just natural to be like this. But I
Right.
think it's a change, a cultural change, behavioral change that should take place over and over. So, and I have some topics here I want to discuss with you. And the first
Sure.
one is precision medicine.
Okay.
So I like very much your take on precision medicine, especially you being an oncologist, which I think you may have more examples than me as a cardiologist of successful, biomarkers or whatever. But even though you recognize uncertainty, can you talk about this?
I guess I think it's a very interesting topic. I mean, I think like you, we both acknowledge that this is something that there's a lot of enthusiasm and maybe even hype about. We constantly hear that precision medicine is changing the rules of medicine, that it's leading to so many lives saved. And I guess I'd say that, oncology is further along than cardiology in the sense that we have more genome targeted drugs. We have more drugs that we look for a genomic abnormality and then we drug that abnormality than cardiology does. But even in our field, if you look at it sort of objectively, it's quite it's quite few. It's only the exceptional cases. So we did a paper a few years ago where we looked at what percent of cancer patients who will die are even eligible for a genome targeted drug, assuming that the drug is free and everybody is sequenced, which are two things that don't happen. The drug is not free; it's $100,000, and everyone is not sequenced. But let's assume that both those things are true. We find about 9% of all the patients with cancer are even eligible, and only about 4% of them will have the tumor shrink and
Okay.
have a response, a tumor shrinkage more than 30%. And that's not even to say how many people live longer or live better. That's another question. That's a smaller proportion. But already we know 92%, 91% of people not even eligible, 96% of people either ineligible or will not have a response to these drugs. So it already puts it in, I think, a whole nother light. We looked at it year by year and we find it grows about 1% per year. So it's not taking off like some proponents say. It's really slow and steady growth. So it's going to be at 100% in 200 years from now, sort of thing. I think it's sobering. I think it reminds us to have some humility. And then the other thing that people don't say, which I think you probably will agree, is they think that precision medicine means you don't need randomized control trials. And that is absolutely wrong. You still need randomized control trials. You just need to construct them in a new and more clever way. You can test the strategy of sequencing. You can test particular groups of people in whom you find biomarkers. You can randomize within the group. But you still need randomization unless you have therapies that are parachutes. And, we don't have those therapies, sadly.
Right, right. And by the way, I like very much your paper on the parachute.
I know. Yeah.
But the thing is, I think people confuse precision with prediction.
Yes.
Prediction is one thing, but within prediction, there is uncertainty. Prediction is about probability. So even if you have a good biomarker or artificial intelligence, whatever, it will give us a probability. So I
Yes.
think one of the difficulties people think is, risk aversion or aversion of anything that means uncertainty. And I like very much William Osler quote that medicine is the science of uncertainty and the art of probability. So I think
Right.
this is the way we should think. And I get very unhappy when people overestimate precision medicine because it goes against what I said, the next cognitive revolution in medicine, which is recognizing uncertainty
Yes.
and know how to embrace uncertainty in medical decision. Of course, it's about prediction. It's good that we have better prediction, but it doesn't mean the same as we know everything. So precision, people say that I will know exactly what to do with a patient at the right time. But even if something is beneficial, I have a saying that it's rarely beneficial. Even if something is truly beneficial, the NNT would be like, well, whatever, 20, 30. It's more probable, individually speaking, not to have an effect than to have an effect. So I
Right. So I
think,
see. I totally agree. Which is that the revolution in medicine is thinking probabilistically, thinking about uncertainty, and realizing that for any one person, you will never know the fate with or without your treatment. For any one person, you have to think about it on average.
Yeah.
And even when you have these precise therapies, there are still people who don't benefit in those precise groups and people who do benefit in perhaps the group that doesn't have the marker even to this day. And so it's still probabilistic. It's just
Yeah.
probability at a different level.
Right,
Yeah.
right, great. So changing topics now. I liked very much your discussion with Dr. Frank Harris
Oh,
about Bayesian analysis, and I think I had the same feeling as you have. My problem with this, I know it's more intuitive because it talks about the probability of something to be true. So it's better in this way than, for example, a frequentist analysis. But my problem with this is the pretest probability. I have the sense
yes.
that people overestimate the pretest probability, so it's easier for a trial to be positive using Bayesian analysis. Do you have the same take?
I 100% agree. I think the pretest probability is the crux of the issue. And I think that every bias in medicine is to overestimate. There is no bias that says underestimate. Everyone wants to be successful and claim discovery and have a cure and offer a treatment change and change the paradigm. And they all have incentive to overestimate pretest probability. And I think that the reality is that pretest probability is often very, very low because biology is difficult and improving upon biology is very, very difficult. And so I think pretest probability is probably generally overestimated, which may make it easier. But I think it's difficult, and I don't know, we're doing some kind of work to try to map this out a little bit. So I don't want to scoop myself, but
Okay.
I think it's a very interesting question. I share your intuitive sense.
Yeah, yeah. So usually actually I look at this for reference of this, but I hear this a lot. I couldn't find the original reference, but when a hypothesis is born, it has only 10% chance to be true.
It has
And
to be even less. I mean,
yeah,
let's take one example, cancer drugs. So we know from a number of investigations that maybe the probability of a cancer drug that enters phase one testing to drug approval is something like 4 to 9%. That's phase one to drug approval. But what about before phase one? Maybe it's 20 to 1 or 100 to 1 before phase one. And just because you get your drug approved doesn't mean it's actually a transformative drug. As we all know, there's so many very
yeah,
marginal drugs that are approved. So I think we must be talking about 3%, 1%, maybe less, half of 1%. That's the probability a compound will actually benefit somebody. And so and those are all good hypotheses. I'm sure they
yeah,
have some preclinical rationale. I think the probability a hypothesis will lead to something that makes people's lives better is very, very, very low.
yeah.
And it's been that way throughout all of human history. And that should give us some humility before we claim we're finding all these successful
Yeah,
things.
and it's been demonstrated that physicians overestimate the benefit of medical conduct, and the other side is we underestimate the harm.
Yes.
So that's the other point. But what I like actually of Bayes, and I use this a lot, is the Bayes way of thinking. So when I read a paper and I think that hypothesis doesn't make much sense, even if it's a good paper who is positive, I think the post-test probability of that to be true is not so good. It needs replication. It needs another one. And one example that we had in common, I wrote about this, and I read also your article on circulation outcomes, was the fish oil study, because all other studies were negative, consistently negative. How come a study like that come up with a relative risk reduction similar to statin therapy or something like this? Just because it's a little bit more purified. So
Yes.
it doesn't make sense. The pretest probability of that to be true is very low. So it's not enough to have only one study. Although I look at that study and I think it's a well done study, but even though the post-test probability, we need more to consider that true. So this way of analyzing a trial, and we analyze the quality of the trial, of the study, whatever, and in the context of the probability of the hypothesis to be true is the way I do always a kind of a Bayesian interpretation, not statistical Bayesian, but I have to consider how good is that idea before concluding about that. What's your
I'm the exact same way. That's how I think about studies. They have to be thought of in the context of the other studies. And maybe we cannot do it mathematically, And that's not because that's a limit, I think, of the amount of mathematical certainty in this space, because we can't quantify for
Right.
things with pretest probability like fish oil. What is the pretest? We don't have that data.
Yeah.
But I do
Yeah.
agree with you. Fish oil, that's a problematic study, the Vasepa study. One, it's the only study that's positive. Everything else is negative.
Right.
Two, the control arm of that study used the mineral oil capsules,
Right.
and they had very high rates of diarrhea. And perhaps the mineral oil is impairing the absorption of something else, like the statin therapy or something like that.
Yeah.
That's the kind of study that you must have a confirmatory trial, and that's the purpose of our article. We said these are studies that need confirmatory studies because the pretest probability was low. There are design elements of the study that make one wonder, and the post-test probability now is only equivocal because you started with a weak pretest probability. It's equivocal now. So now we have the uncertainty. We need the confirmatory study.
Right. And I like to analyze the pretest probability also, taking into consideration that field. For example, nutrition.
Yes.
Nutrition usually do not work, and when it works, very tiny effect size. So I knew it was not probably true. That trial of the Mediterranean diet.
PrettyMed, yeah.
Yeah, PrettyMed. It showed like 30% relative risk reduction of a diet, Mediterranean diet, comparing to another good diet. It didn't make sense. So I wrote at that time that the positive predictive value of that trial was not to be good. Besides, it was truncated and it had like kind of a performance bias. And then we discovered like last year that it was not actually randomized well.
Right. Yes.
But it's not so difficult to understand that 30% relative risk reduction for a diet.
It's too good to be true.
Yeah, that's the way I think we should, organize our thinking, teach people.
I agree.
Okay, Jack, changing subjects to your, your specialty, which is medical reversal. I'd like your definition of medical reversal.
You like it? Oh, my definition is, I guess I'd say a medical reversal is a practice that had been utilized off protocol outside of clinical studies, but used by community doctors, by practicing physicians, maybe not everywhere, but at least in some pockets, which in retrospect, based upon robust randomized studies, was found to offer no net benefit or even net harm. That's the definition.
Yeah. So you think if you take, I'm talking because we had this project of one of my PhD students about medical reversal. Maybe we should collaborate on this one. So we are starting this. We don't have results yet, but we took some cardiology guidelines from the last decade, and we are comparing with the ones, the newer ones, and to see to find recommendations that was there before and it's not there anymore, and also tie this with a good piece of negative evidence. Do you think it's a good definition of medical reversal, something that was in the guideline and disappeared then? Like intra-aortic balloon pump, for example, it was recommended for cardiogenic shock. So I had this idea of taking the guidelines to find a bunch of things that then I would be able to talk about incidence of medical reversal. For example, from this 100 recommendations, there was like 20% incidence, and also making associations with the level of evidence before. You think it's a good definition of medical reversal by the guidelines?
I think it's a good way, because what's clever about your way is that all of the ways that we've looked at it, we've never been able to say the answer to that question. Of 100 recommendations, what percent are reversed? We don't have the denominator. Your way will allow you to get that. The only thing I'll add to your way is you should look, when it falls out of the guidelines, ask yourself, why did it fall out of the guidelines? Was it because there's a negative study?
Right.
Was it because we just lost enthusiasm, or those sorts of things? But I bet most of the times it falls out. Many of the times there probably is a landmark negative study, and those are true reversals in my mind.
Right.
I'm surprised you put your ideas out on your podcast. So I always try. Sometimes I'm tempted to say something that we could work on, but then I keep it to myself because I want to get it done. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it's we can do it together anyway. And
but also people listening are going to listen.
I know. But we are ahead. We are ahead of time. So actually, I was, your eLife articles on medical reversal cardiology was, the most, the higher number of medical reversals you could detect. And I have the feeling you like cardiology, and you talk about a lot of, I think you get good examples in cardiology. And one of the examples we have been talking about is, the Entresto thing. And Entresto was recently approved in Brazil for our health universal system to pay for that very expensive drug. And the story is that actually, the technical evaluation was not in favor, but they made a mistake because they agree with the efficacy based on the paradigm, and they were not in favor based on the cost. Then, after the technical report, they make like a public consultation, like thousands of people can get into the site and write. So it's kind of inverting the hierarchy of things, because first you analyze technique, then you ask the public. So many physicians writing it's a very good drug. In my impression, it's very good, and I don't know, patient, whatever. So that's the way it got finally approved. I want to know your opinion about the paradigm trial.
Well, I think you and I agree about this trial a lot. I've read your paper about it, and we've written some similar papers. I think it's a flawed study. You're testing a novel compound, sacubitril, linked to valsartan, given at 320 milligrams a day, the maximum FDA-approved dose, versus enalapril given at 10 BID with a submaximal dose. 50% the maximal enalapril labeled dose. The trial has a double drug run-in period, 14 days, then 29 days. You're on the interventional drug longer, so that gives a greater time to weed out people who are idiosyncratically intolerant to your drug. And you're on it last, so that it's actually a withdrawal. It tests whether or not somebody who's taken enalapril for 14 days and then taken the novel drug for 29 days, is it better to stay on what you're currently on or switch back to enalapril, which you haven't seen in a month? That's really the study design. It's flawed in so many ways. I mean, it doesn't need a run-in period. It should be a comparison of people who are ACE intolerant. Right. That's the study. So then they're on an ARB, plus or minus the novel drug, and no run-in. That's the right trial to run. Yeah. And so this is also included in our circulation article. It needs a confirmatory trial for for people with impaired ejection fraction. Since we wrote that article, we now, of course, have the HuffPuff study, the preserved ejection fraction study. That's a negative study. Right. At least the control is valsartan in that study.
Right.
But the p-value is quite close to significant. So people are already hailing it as a success. I think both of these trials have problems. But the paradigm study has a lot of problems.
So the paradigm study, the one you mentioned, right, that was just presented in ASC and published in the New England Journal of Medicine. By the way, I like very much your criticism on the New England Journal of Medicine. I only use for my students examples on that. And so it was actually, what did you think about the endpoints they used, cumulative endpoints? So one single patient could contribute with more than one event, because they took into consideration the number of heart failures admission and not the first admission or first death. And in my opinion, it violates a basic statistical principle.
Independence, yeah.
Independence.
Independence of events, yeah.
Right. Also, it's more like it's softer endpoint than the first one.
Yeah.
So I have a problem with this, and also the p-value was not statistically significant. So people keep saying it was barely significant. It was almost significant. Well, what did you think? Sometimes I think it's like people take trials like a game. You almost won the game or not. So the 0.06. How do you interpret it?
Yeah, I guess I'd put it to you this way. I think that In the current system, we draw lines. And the reason we draw lines is because there will always be the temptation to say that something on the other side of the line is still good enough. No matter, and we need to resist that temptation. We need to achieve what we said we will achieve and declare failure when we don't. For instance, I just saw somebody tweet this morning. There is a company that makes a cancer drug that did a randomized trial. The hazard ratio is 0.99, and the confidence interval spans 1, and the p-value is 0.95. 0.95. And they're saying this is going in the right direction.
Wow.
Human beings will always say it's going in the right direction, as long as it's going one step over one direction versus the other direction.
Right.
So that's why we draw pre-specified hypotheses. We have stringent cutoffs, and you achieve what you achieve, or you fall short.
Okay.
And the FDA doesn't play games on this. This is the one thing. For as lax as they are, they do not play games on this cutoff. You draw your line, and if you don't achieve it, you don't achieve it.
Yeah. I think it needs to be this way because there's so many ways of multiplicity analysis and so many things that makes this alpha of 0.05 actually very easy to achieve. Actually, so in the world we live in this scientific ecosystem, maybe 0.05 is too high a threshold, right? So I like not that I think that's the solution, but I like the idea of Ioannidis to say we should put one more zero on this alpha thing, considering the way it is.
John Ioannidis and others have signed on to that petition. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's particular on this trial, how valid is 0.06 under this type of cumulative events that violate statistical significance. So, but as you said, I think I like Kahneman's optimism bias, and we have this bias. It's like human nature. So we have to be aware of our own cognitive bias. Sometimes I think it's not like people. There is conflicts of interests and all, but sometimes it's, people are naive. So we've been, in this conversation, criticized many things that we think is not proved. But one thing I'm not comfortable is when people criticize statin therapy, as if it was not proved to be to have some beneficial. And people even criticize the cholesterol hypothesis as a risk factor. This past weekend, there was an article, English newspaper called "Statin Therapy: Kill or Cure," and there are actually people people discussing this. So, what's your take on statin therapy?
I guess I'd say it's an interesting topic. Maybe about 7 years ago, we did some work in it, but it's been a long time since I've, kept up with it. I find that the debate has been going on, the same debate for all these years, so I just got bored of it. But I guess I'd say that what I thought was interesting is I think we should be upfront that there is no debate that for someone who suffered a plaque rupture event, who had an elevated cholesterol, that statins are absolutely improve outcomes. I think where the debate always has been is about whether or not people who have risk factors for cardiovascular disease, but have never had an event, so the primary prevention population. And I guess I'd say that the questions, of course, is taking this pill for the rest of your life improve your survival or quality of life? And there are meta-analyses that say it does improve your survival. The cholesterol treatment trial lists multiple analyses. And there are some meta-analyses, like the Kaushik-Ray meta-analysis, that says it fell short of that bar. So that was the last I looked. And of course, now there's even more meta-analyses than ever, and they all say they're leaning more towards that it improves OS. The question about quality of life is difficult. Some of these are older studies that didn't really collect quality of life. And then you have a whole slew of these sort of cardiovascular endpoints like MI and stroke, and it looks like there's favorable outcomes there. Yeah. Then there's the question of the side effects in the pivotal trial versus the real world. Some of the side effects, some of the trials had a drug run-in period, which may mitigate the side effects a little bit.
Right.
So I guess I'd say, it's been a long time since I followed this debate, but I think what would solve the debate would be, things that I've always supported. If we had data sharing of all the trial data, I think that would allow a lot of people to kind of get their hands into it.
Right.
I think one of the other questions is about whether or not Americans in 2019 and Americans in 1979 are similar. They're very different. We've seen that these aspirin studies have kind of shifted.
Yeah.
It might be interesting to kind of ask about changes in demographic characteristics in these trials versus for the real world today. But no, I don't keep up with it too much anymore.
Yeah, but I agree with you in terms of probably, very probably, side effects are underestimated by the trials.
Mm-hmm.
It is one point. So I think it's more discussion about a clinical decision if you are going to prescribe or not, and share decision making. Then a discussion of the intrinsic effect. I kind of think it's unscientific to say it has no anti-atherosclerotic effect.
Right, it does.
And regarding mortality, and people say this, it's not about mortality because primary prevention people don't die. That's the thing. So we're not going to be able to show reduction in mortality in a very low risk population for death, but people don't want to have a heart attack or a stroke. So if
so use it for the quality of life benefit.
Yeah, if you have high cholesterol, that's one important point. If you have high cholesterol and you want to try an NNT of 40,
what do you define as high cholesterol? I hear now it's 71 is high.
No, this is wrong. This is the effect size is very small if you try this. But what I define is a LDL of 160, more than 106 LDL. I think I'm comfortable in discussing with the patient about that.
And what do you do for ages? What age group do you discuss it in? Any age?
Any age.
But what about on the younger end? What's the youngest person you'll put on?
What I take for the younger person, I say it's like paying for retirement. Okay, you're paying now for having this kind of beneficial effect 20 years from now or 30 years from now. But it will. I mean, if you are to start, maybe if you really have high cholesterol, if you have to start 20 years from now, why not start earlier? If you want, it depends a lot on the preference and values of the patients. I have patients who really don't like to take medicine, and I know my recommendation will be, I will not recommend. And the other ones are those who are like kind of they want to have control and decrease the probability. They are up to that. So I think it goes on the preference of the patient. But what I think is to criticize the idea that it's a concept, the cholesterol concept, that the decreased cholesterol reduce. I think it's unscientific, and people usually don't go and talk about the articles like we are talking about the paradigm. They give other reasons why they. For example, it's not about cholesterol, it's about insulin resistance, it's about inflammation. Well, I think it's about everything together. Cholesterol is just one of the many risk factors, and if you want to control this one, it's an option. So
how do you think about, I guess I'd say, the statin class of medication has always shown, I think, commensurate LDL reduction and improvement in cardiovascular outcomes. These other drugs we have, Zetia and the PCSK9, how do you think about those classes of drugs?
Yeah, they serve not to be used, but to confirm the cholesterol hypothesis, those trials. Because when you put Zetia, even if in people with already low cholesterol, like 100, and you decrease LDL 100 to 60, the relative risk reduction is only 6%, but it is there. So it kind of shows that reducing cholesterol, it reduces events. And the other drugs, the newer drugs, injectable drugs, and very expensive, NNT, it's not worth it, but it's another way to reduce cholesterol that shows beneficial effect. So it's not the statin pleiotropic property. it's more simple than we think. It's the reducing cholesterol. No, and
That's good. I'll send you a paper that we wrote on at least Zetia. We looked at the FDA. They did not give them the drug label for that Improve It study.
yeah,
So we looked at this tipping point analysis. I'll send you this paper. You
it
might
is
find it interesting.
6% relative risk reduction. I think it's the tiniest I ever saw
Nice.
for a
Yeah.
drug. So so they took a very high risk population, so they were able to get a NNT of 50, but that's why I think we should not only look at the NNT, we should look at the relative risk reduction, because it is kind of a constant property of the drug.
Yes.
Right. So we covered some nice points, but the last thing that I want to ask you is: do you think evidence-based medicine is prevailing? It is a movement that is changing medicine. What's your take on this? Like on this name that was invented back in the 90s, I guess, the 80s. What do you think? It's make us evolving.
I think that's the greatest question. I guess I'd say that evidence-based medicine is probably, I have always said, it's the single greatest innovation of the 20th century of medicine. People always think they think it'll be the discovery of insulin or the finding of penicillin. It's the idea that for most of what we do in biomedicine, we are not hitting home runs. We're not in the parachute business. We are talking about interventions with modest to marginal effect sizes. And the only way to separate modest to marginal effect sizes from your optimism bias, from your conflict of interest, is to run well-done randomized controlled trials. That idea is the greatest innovation of the 20th century. And the name evidence-based medicine, of course, comes from the Gordon Guyatt paper, I think in 96 or 92 in JAMA. But even before it had that name, and Sackett and others were doing it. But I guess John Ioannidis wrote that paper recently called Evidence-Based Medicine Has Been Hijacked.
Right.
And he says now, 25, 30 years after the onset of evidence-based medicine, the words and language of evidence-based medicine have been co-opted by the industry and other unscrupulous vendors to push products and do trials like Paradigm, which are really, frankly, uninformative studies, flawed studies. That's a great example of how a randomized trial has been hijacked. Double drug run-in period, control arm and intervention that are we're making two different changes, ARB plus novel drug versus ACE, different doses. I guess what I'd say is, and also I'm in my profession of oncology, where we have, I think, an ignorance of evidence-based medicine, rampant ignorance. Just this weekend, I saw people saying, do we need a randomized trial for this drug that is not curative and improves some surrogate metrics, which they have confused as real metrics, because we've totally bought into surrogates in our field. So I guess I'd say that I think we are not winning. I don't think we're winning right now, but I think we will win, because the idea, as you say, it's not, even to call it evidence-based medicine is wrong. In scientific medicine, it's wrong. This is medicine. The only rational way to think about medicine is to think about it in this way. And I believe that people will eventually do what's rational. They will see the light, but they just let a lot of things get in the way. We have more trials than ever before, but we probably have more flawed studies than ever before as well. And I think that people have made a lot of money from the current system, and they are, it's like anybody. No matter what job somebody works in the mind of that person, they do not believe that they're contributing to any wrongdoing, and they always have a justification for what they do. And similarly, I think that's how we feel about our field. But I do think it will course correct. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, I like to be optimist too, because I think that this type of discussion we are having here was not prevalent back 30 years ago.
That's true.
Right? So I think the discussion is taking pace. And I agree, evidence-based medicine was not invented in the 80s. Maybe it was invented in the beginning of this last century.
Yeah.
When the Bradford Hill, Richard Dahl article about smoking and lung cancer, that was a piece of evidence that changed the way people saw smoking. Nobody imagined smoking would be causing that. Everybody smoked. Physicians smoked all the time. So that was, and then a few years later, streptomycin clinical trial published. So that was the beginning of evidence-based medicine. And maybe if we just we had not created this name, people would see it more naturally. Because sometimes I feel like a prejudice. Oh no, we are evidence-based medicine. You don't like you're like you're reading articles or something like this. But what I always try to say is evidence-based medicine is not for a scientist. It's for the consumer of evidence. And people must analyze the quality of what you're consuming. It should be part of any physician's ability. So I agree very much with your take, but I hope you are improving, and this conversation with you was very important for people get to know you in Brazil, those who still don't know, and maybe we can collaborate, exchange ideas, and writing things. Thank you very
I'd
much,
love
Vinay.
to. I have an idea for you that you gave me, but I'll tell you to you after we stop the recording.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much. See you
Thank
next
you.
time.